Good evening. Welcome to the Wagner Group, Russia's Shadow Army. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for an expert discussion of a very timely subject. Wagner emerged in 2014 and has taken on greater prominence since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Tonight, experts on the entity will be discussing Wagner's current status, the effect of its former leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed rebellion, and what the future for Russian private warfare looks like since his dramatic death in August of 2023. The conversation will be moderated by Amy Mackinnon, an award-winning national security reporter at POLITICO. She will be joined by Colin P. Clarke, Director of Research at the Soufan Group and Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center, and author of the forthcoming Moscow's Mercenaries, The Rise and Fall of the Wagner Group. And finally, Candace, Rondeaux, Senior Director of the Future Frontlines Program and Planetary Politics Initiative at the New America Foundation, and she is the author of Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos. Now, John Lechner could not be with us, but I imagine his new book, Death is Our Business, may be mentioned. And it was interesting to see the New York Times book review of Candace and John's book reviewed together. So they're interesting and complementary. All right, enough from me. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here today moderating this conversation with two of these really world-class experts on the Wagner Group, which is not an easy entity to study, as I think we're going to learn in the course of this conversation. But I want to start with setting the scene. Colin, what is the Wagner Group? Kind of set some parameters of what we're actually talking about here, and how is it different from other kind of paramilitary or private military contractors?
It's a great question. First of all, I want to start by thanking the Spy Museum for the generous invitation, and then also acknowledging my co-authors, Chris Faulkner and Raphael Parents. I wouldn't have been able to write the book without them, and I'm the third author on the book. They're the first two, so credit where credit is due. I think, Wagner, we referred a couple of times in the book to Wagner as a Swiss Army knife, meaning that it does a lot of different things. It's not really just one thing. Yes, it's a private military company. The United States also has designated as a transnational criminal organization, which it is too. In certain theaters, it's a counterinsurgent force. Not a very effective one, I would argue. But across Ukraine, across the Sahel in Africa, across North Africa, these various theaters, Wagner plays different roles. Some kinetic, some non-kinetic. It's really kind of a jack of all trades. It can train, advise, and assist. It works hand in glove with other violent non-state actors on the ground. It's worked with Lebanese Hezbollah, various Syrian and Libyan militias, African armed forces that support junta regimes. So it really does a little bit of everything. It does some things better than others. It's also extremely rapacious when it comes to resources. It goes in, it protects energy infrastructure, oil wells, and it's also extremely violent. Actually had a piece in Foreign Policy a couple of years ago. It was titled something like Our Brand is Violence, or Extreme Violence. And if you've seen, and as the title of Candace's book suggests with the Sledgehammer reference, this is a group that kills people as a calling card.
So Candace, I actually was going to ask about that, but seeing as you brought it up, the title of your book, Putin's Sledgehammer, where does this come from?
Well, it comes from a couple of places. I think the origin story really starts from a little video snippet that started circulating online in about June of 2017. It appeared on multiple websites. It was, not even 2 minutes. And it depicted several men, mostly Russian-speaking, clad in military gear, wielding a sledgehammer and beating a man on the ground in a sort of unnamed location, which later turned out to be a gas plant in Syria that was deeply connected to an oligarch who was also close to Vladimir Putin, and not Yevgeny Prigozhin in that instance, actually. And that video clip, which was so brutal, was one of a series, about 4 actually, that ultimately ended up circulating online on Telegram, on different websites. It just went viral, and it became kind of the rally point for the Wagner Group. Soon after it appeared online, and people were trying to figure out who was actually behind it, who were the guys who were wielding these hammers, this hammer, and torturing this guy on camera. Ultimately, it became this kind of branding symbol. There were T-shirts, there were mugs, sweatshirts, patches, bearing the symbol of a soldier with a sledgehammer beating a horned devil, which is kind of the way the Wagner Group conceived of its enemies, and particularly, kind of drew on these sort of white supremacists memes to target, people in the Middle East, in Africa, as sort of like savage beasts. And Wagner was supposed to be sort of this orthodox Christian force for good, basically fighting the devil.
And the person that was killed in that clip was a civilian, if I remember.
That's right.
Your report on this, which is just adds an extra morbid twist to the way that this image entered the mythology of the Wagner Group. Candace, in your book, the first section, you really you tell the story of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the kind of founder and leader of the group for much of its history until he died in a fiery plane crash a couple of years ago. And it kind of maps with the story of post-Soviet Russia as well. But could you just kind of take us back to Prigozhin's origin stories from a humble hot dog seller? You had some fun terms for him in the book, and how he ends up becoming this paramilitary boss.
Yeah, I mean, his story is so interesting, and I think what's interesting about his story is how much it parallels Putin's story. They're separated by about 10 years in age. So Prigozhin was born in 1961, and then Putin just about 9 years before that, and both of them grew up in Soviet St. Petersburg, or Leningrad at the time. So they had this sort of common bond, just being from what was kind of the seat of imperial and cultural power of Russia for generations upon generations. But the big difference between them was that Putin was, as a kid, actually, he was kind of a thug. He was a ne'er-do-well in school, and then eventually got into judo. As we all know, he's like a famous judo champ, and kind of course-corrected by becoming KGB agent, and ultimately working in East Germany with the KGB before returning to St. Petersburg. Prigozhin, kind of in parallel, comes from slightly more middle-class stock, was kind of a good boy until allegedly he had this accident while training for cross-country skiing at an Olympic academy in St. Petersburg. And that sort of set him off on this life of crime, basically. So you have these two interesting characters who come from like this sort of opposing classes almost, that ultimately become intertwined when the fall of the Soviet Union happens. And there's just sort of massive, economic chaos, social chaos, Afghan veterans coming home, a lot of churn. And Prigozhin and Putin kind of rose upon the waves of all of that churn. And at the time, actually, when their roads converged in around 1992-3, they were each on a path to power, where Prigozhin was sort of this guy who was getting into casinos. He was deep into the grocery business, which was, a big deal in Russia at the time. I know, you would probably know too. Groceries was a kind of an issue at the time. Getting good food was a difficult thing. So he became a really entrepreneurial spirit in the world of food culture in St. Petersburg, opened a fabulous restaurant called Old Customs House, which became Prigozhin's kind of clubhouse when he was deputy mayor under Anatoly Sobchak at the time. So interesting origin stories. That's kind of where it begins. And they track together quite a lot because he becomes basically Putin's favorite caterer, his go-to fix-it guy, and that's how he gets the name Putin's chef.
And how does Prigozhin go from being an entrepreneur, albeit a shady entrepreneur, how does he get into the paramilitary business? When does that turn happen? Because that's a very different skill set.
It is and it isn't. It's interesting, actually, because, to be Putin's favorite caterer from, deputy mayor and then eventually president of Russia circa 2000 is to also be intimately involved in setting the stage for security, right? He became very close with Putin's bodyguards and his security detail. They had to coordinate a lot, especially for state dinners. And so that was his first was that coordination around those big dinners, big state dinners. For instance, there was famously, of course, he fed George Bush and his wife when they visited St. Petersburg for the G7.
Very different times.
Very different times.
G8 back in the States.
Sorry. Well, it was the beginning of G7 to G8.
Picture that picture peering over.
Yeah. So, the path starts there, but eventually he kind of ingratiates himself with the military class, which of course is, increasingly closing in a very tight circle around Putin in the sort of early to mid 2000s. And it's really the transformation of the military. The Russian military was always challenged, but in 2010 there was an effort to reform it and to privatize some elements, including catering and laundry service, which is his first big contract, basically.
And then when do we first? I think I want to stay with you for one more beat about kind of telling the narrative arc of when do we first see what you would identify as the Wagner Group? Because if I remember correctly, there was never an entity registered as Wagner LLC in Russia that anyone could really identify. So when do you first start to see the contours of the group that comes to be known as the Wagner Group?
Indeed, like in a really important distinction, and here's where I might differ a little bit from even sort of John Lechner and you a little bit about sort of like how to characterize the Wagner Group. A private company in Putin's Russia is a little bit of a misnomer, particularly if it has to do with any sort of military enterprise. The origin story really starts with the Russia's break with Ukraine over its decision to try for EU ascension. So around 2013, Russia's military elites start thinking we have a problem and start sort of plotting with Putin, obviously, on a potential response to an EU ascension for Ukraine and potentially NATO ascension eventually as well. So as early as 2013, there's rumblings of using some sort of irregular or separatist forces, not visible to most, but within the Kremlin circles, very visible to those who are kind of responsible. But really officially, sort of May 2014 is when the people who are most associated with the Wagner Group, Dmitry Utkin, whose call sign was Wagner, he sort of adopted that mantra or that moniker. So around May 2014 is when you start to see something that looks like the Wagner Group, but was really called Battalion Group V, which was a signifier of actually it being one of many experimental irregular forces that was deployed in Donbass on the heels of the Crimea invasion.
And wasn't that Hitler's favorite composer? Isn't there some part of the mythology goes back to that as well?
That is also correct. And, there are some weird little niche pieces of sort of the origins of the Wagner moniker. Utkin, as you know, he was obsessed with Hitler and sort of Nazi power. He famously had a couple of, SS bolt tattoos on his neck. All over his body, he had all kinds of, Nazi symbols. And he was kind of obsessed with this sort of blue beret culture, which, the VDV airborne, was kind of like our Green Berets, was really sort of muscular and very sort of supremacist in its notion. And the Apocalypse Now, of course, is another sort of reference for Wagner. Famously, there's a helicopter scene where Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries is played while destroying a Vietnamese village. And lastly, and this is like a weird little twist, there's a guy named Edvard Wagner, who was the quartermaster for the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, death squads that operated sort of at the back end of what is now today Donbass, basically, and set the stage for the liquidation of Jewish villages and communities all across that part of what was then the Soviet Union, or becoming the Soviet Union.
So one of several.
A triple entendre is what I like to call it.
Terrifying choices for the origin story there. Colin, I want to kind of go back to what makes the Wagner Group different, because a lot of countries, even democracies, have got private military contractors, right? The most well-known from the US was of course Blackwater. What makes Wagner different in terms of its activities or its ownership, or what kind of makes it this, and aside from its,
Sure. I think, I mentioned the Swiss Army knife before, and a lot of these types of PMCs are called upon to do different things in different theaters. Wagner just did so many of them in so many different locales, and it was backed by the Kremlin. I mean, that was the big question for a while, which was, how autonomous is this group really? Is this really just an extension of influence and muscle from the Russian state, which Putin eventually did reveal after Prigozhin's death, talking about how the Russians funded the Wagner Group. But, it just operated on a different level. I mean, Candace mentioned before, it was one of many seedlings, right? And this is just a group. We're here having an event about the Wagner Group because it grew to be a brand in and of itself. And I think, when you look at where Wagner operates, particularly in Africa, it's really interesting too, because Wagner is sold to these junta regimes as, a coup-proofing mechanism, right? And I think, when we talk about, the kind of zeitgeist in Washington these days is not counterterrorism. It's very much great power competition. But when you look at what Wagner does in a lot of these African regimes, in a lot of these African states, it's sold as a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency force. It's making the problem actually far worse. And the French have drawn down. But just, I think, the breadth of what Wagner does, the way that it's able to kind of work with so many different actors, with the Russian Ministry of Defense, with Lebanese Hezbollah, with irregular militias on the ground, and then the extent of activities that it engages in, including disinformation campaigns. It's kind of a one-stop shop. What do you need? What sort of nefarious activities can we help you work with? And that's not to say that other PMCs don't get engaged in similar things, but I think when you just look at the global scale of Wagner, if you look at the brand that it really kind of rose to, it's really unlike anything else in recent history that we can point to.
How did it operate differently in different countries? Could you maybe kind of outline an overview of how did Wagner in, say, the Central African Republic differ from its operations in Libya versus Ukraine versus Syria?
Yeah, so in theaters like Libya and Syria, it's kind of more closely tied to the Russian Ministry of Defense because it needs and relies on the Ministry of Defense more, right, for lift, for some of the kind of more military hardware type, whether it's weapon systems, training that it needs. But in in Mali, and other places, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's where you start seeing some of the autonomy and some of the issues with command and control unravel. They're also doing different things. And, for a while, again, these are mercenaries. This is pay for play. And so depending on how this is painted by, kind of Russian propaganda, some of these missions are held differently than others. Some of them are really just go in, this is a cash grab, we're going to go in, we're going to extract resources, we're going to keep, we're going to keep this regime in power, but we're also going to destabilize the country because that's good for business, actually. Because if it's an unstable country, they need us, right? And so it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They come there, they don't actually solve the problem. In many ways, they make it worse, but then they don't leave. And so it's operating different ways in different places with kind of different levels of authority, different command and control than in other theaters.
You said there's different levels of command and control. Where has the control been tightest in terms of its links with the Russian state, and where has it had the most autonomy to operate?
I think, modern day Ukraine would be among the tightest. But then you also, and maybe Candace will get into this later, but I think that's where the brand was the most heavily diluted. And, to go back to this conversation of great powers, once Russia went into the jails and prisons and started emptying them and conscripting people into Wagner, I made a comment once, like, great powers don't do that. They don't go in and take, prisoners with HIV and tell them they can go fight in return for medicine. That's not a great power, right? And that's what we're seeing there. But I think it was also an act of desperation, realizing that things were not going according to plan. And so there needed to be a kind of much tighter leash, right? Ultimately, I think, Prigozhin saw himself as too big to fail. The one person you don't challenge in Russia, though, is Vladimir Putin, and that kind of disrespect that he showed ultimately did catch up with him. But the kind of constant diatribes against, Shoigu and Gerasimov, and he became kind of notorious for these videos where he's just cursing them out and, where's the ammunition? And much of it tied back to credit. Who got credit for perceived Russian successes? You started seeing this early on in Syria with certain battles when they were won. Palmyra, for example, the Russian MOD wants to then go claim that as success. And Prigozhin saying, no, any success we have is actually because of what Wagner guys are doing. And so you start seeing friction early on. It happens to different levels in different countries.
Candace, what impact did Wagner's deployment in Ukraine have on the group in terms of its public profile, but also its relationship with the Kremlin?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Just before the start of the war and the invasion in February 2022, we were monitoring with our research group social media associated with the Wagner Group, both on Telegram, on Vkontakte, which is kind of the Russian Facebook. And, what we noticed, first of all, just was like, year over year growth in sort of membership in these groups. And mostly having to do with like sort of sparked by spikes in casualties. So for instance, after the 2018 confrontation between U.S. Special Forces and Wagner forces in Syria near the Conoco gas plant, weirdly, huge numbers of people sort of flocked to join Wagner's online presence, right? And so every time there'd be some sort of major event that would get publicity having to do with a major casualty event, you would see that really spike. And that happened just before the beginning of the war. We saw sort of it creeping up. But literally, like within maybe a week, not even, of Wagner sort of officially announcing itself on social media and saying, we're coming in. And that was around March 10th of 2022. We saw this just tremendous transformation of all of these accounts. I mean, millions and millions of followers. Suddenly we're now following these kind of very uniformly branded Wagner channels. They all had the exact same images. It was almost like sort of like McDonald's, it was like just, you could have like a Big Mac version of Wagner, or like a quarter pounder with cheese, but depending on like which region you were in.
Some ways reminiscent of ISIS back in the day and some of the old
very similar. It's sort of, but that really uniform branding. And that turned out to be a Ministry of Defense operation, essentially, to mobilize people. Because I think one of the things that's really important to understand about the Wagner transformation in the context of Ukraine is, the military itself and the leadership was very divided over what would be necessary to actually pull it off, right? To pull off the occupation of Ukraine. That's clear. We saw kind of the mess that happened afterwards, right? But there were some, and certainly many of them were Wagner fans, generals, colonels who were big Wagner fans, who understood that mobilization was like the biggest problem that Russia would face. Nobody wanted to go to war. Knowing the condition of the military, knowing how they would be treated, knowing that they might be shorted of pay and so forth, or that they would become instant casualties in a meat grinder. And what the mobilization online did, and that sort of brand transformation, is kind of turn Wagner into this super sexy brand. Like join us because we're the virile guys, who know how to get it done. And forget those old fart generals, who are sitting up in their mahogany offices in the Kremlin. So it was a lot about the contrast. But what was interesting is how the GRU, in particular, the military intelligence wing, really leaned into that branding exercise and bought up a lot of real estate online.
I mean, it wasn't until, I think, was it fall of 2022 that Prigozhin actually publicly acknowledged for the first time that he was, behind Wagner. And having operated in the shadows for so many years, there was, as you say, this like explosion of public attention to the group. I think were they not at one point advertised? They had billboards in Russia saying, "Come and join the orchestra." It was this thing. It was the arc of the kind of rise and fall during the first 18 months of the war in Ukraine was an incredible thing to watch, and it was kind of punctuated by the rebellion, where all of a sudden Prigozhin decides to turn his men and go on the march to the Kremlin, although they don't get terribly far, and ultimately the received wisdom is that's probably what signed his death warrant. And I'll start with you, Candace, but Colin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Did he just get too cocky? What made him think that he could get away with this? It just seemed like a suicide mission from the start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think there's only really a couple ways to answer it. First of all, it's important to talk about why did he step out of the shadows in the first place? What was going on there? And Colin, you mentioned quite rightly that there was always this deep rivalry with the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and Prigozhin over who would take credit for all the wins and then who would take credit or be blamed, right, for all the losses, right? This was always kind of the dynamic between them. And it started playing out even before the invasion of Ukraine. There were lawsuits that the Kremlin brought against Prigozhin's various shell companies. There were fistfights between potential replacements for Wagner. Of course, most famously, the head of Redoute, which is another sort of PMC competitor. So all of that was going on in the backdrop, and it's important to understand that's kind of setting the scene for the decision to step out of the shadows was mostly over this issue of who's going to get credit, right? Who's going to win the race for having the sort of most military prowess? Is it going to be Shoigu, or is it going to be me, Prigozhin? And the fact that he was using his criminal background, his sort of knowledge of the prison world, because he'd spent almost a decade in prison on charges of thuggery. That was another kind of added chit, right, in his favor. But ultimately, it's a battle of Bakhmut that kind of just starts to destroy, I think, his credibility as a military leader, which of course he had no real military experience, right? But there he is in his full battle, like on the battlefield, on Telegram, shouting to the rafters, help my guys, protect my guys, give ammo, all that kind of stuff. So he is becoming kind of full of himself, right? He's having kind of one of those moments that you have when you kind of get modestly famous. He just gets sort of a big head. He already had a big head, but his head got a lot bigger. And I think also the other thing, I really do think that the comparison with Colonel Kurtz, if you've seen Apocalypse Now, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about, well, the horror, this kind of psychological break with reality that he, I think, confronted when he saw all of the death and destruction that ultimately he was responsible for happening on the battlefield, particularly in Bakhmut. I think that really kind of drove him mad. He always had that streak, but it was kind of the extreme exposure to 300 guys a day dropping on the battlefield that I think really drove him out of his mind and to march on Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word cocky. Did he get too cocky? I think he definitely got beyond his skis. And, when Wagner was being recognized for whatever tactical victories that were occurring, he had people in his ear telling him that the only reason that we haven't lost yet is because of you, right? And he becomes this kind of, I think Candace is right, this pseudo celebrity in some ways. Can you think of anyone else that would have the nerve to make and release videos criticizing high-ranking Russian generals in that way? Because essentially it's a reflection on Putin, one step removed. And he got away with it. And then so he just kept pushing and pushing. And, when you get to the actual march itself, I mean, I still go back and forth on this. Was this just a bluff that went too far? Did he just kind of gain too momentum? I once compared it to a scene from the movie Old School where Will Ferrell's like, "Come on, guys, we're going streaking. Let's go." And he starts running down the street, but he's the only one there. No one's behind him. He's like, "Come on, let's go." And, you look at Rostov-on-Don, there was this momentum. I mean, I still remember sitting in my office watching this on TV going, is this really happening? Like, is this real or is this a feint? Like, this can't be real. It's a suicide mission. And then to live to tell about it, like, wow, man, Putin's really lost his nerve. He's gotten soft in his old age. But of course, at the end of the day, he does it in classic Godfather style, whacking these guys in a very public way. What was it, 1 month to the day, 2 months to the day of, the actual march. So, which I think is deliberate, symbolic, very much kind of like, shame what happened, look at that. And so a very kind of in the same way that, Russians who criticize the Kremlin fall out of windows. I mean, it's a lot of drafty windows over there. It's a very kind of look what we could do to you at any time, and we're going to do it in a really brutal, painful, and public way.
Stepping back to look at the role that the Wagner Group has played in, as you said, I mean, as we over half a dozen very fragile states around the world. What kind of a challenge does this pose for the United States and, for countries around the world that are invested in, stability and in human rights? And what kind of responses are there to this?
Yeah, I think, from a U.S. perspective, we really were kind of frozen. We don't do really well in what we call gray zone warfare, right? Is that kind of very murky area between war and peace. We're a lot more binary, right? We're either at peace or at war, or depending on the U.S., at war with like a nuclear program, not a country, or something specific, right? But you're right. I mean, Wagner operated in multiple countries. And I think, again, I'll go back to the designation. We designated it as a TCO, a transnational criminal organization. And I remember, I have a colleague that used to be the head of the State Department designation office. Is this a terrorist group? Should it be an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization? Where does it fit? And we spend so much time. I spent 10 years at the RAND Corporation, and we used to joke like we'd get through slide 2 on a 40-slide presentation and we'd be arguing over the definition of terrorism, and then the hour would end and you wouldn't get to any of your data. Like, we do that in the government a little bit. The interagency is a great thing, but like having these kind of constant go-arounds of like, what is this entity? By the time we agree on what it is, they're already in half a dozen different places. So we're not postured for that. We don't counter gray zone warfare well, and that's not just against the Russians. I think it's against the Chinese and some of our other adversaries also. And then we also just really kind of, I think, when we look at what's happened in Africa, we've really drawn back. We just don't value what's happening there. The thing that I think drives me crazy is when I'm saying, why aren't we more active in the Sahel? Why aren't we more active in Central Asia? Well, we're pulling back so we can focus on great power competition. But that's where great power competition's happening, right? And so I don't think we really fundamentally understand what it is still. And thankfully, the Russians are as cumbersome as they are. If they were a little bit more skilled, we'd be in big trouble. I think also the same for the Chinese. Nature abhors a vacuum, but our adversaries can be quite clumsy in filling it. But they're going to get better. They're going to learn their lessons. They're going to improve. And if we don't show up, then we're going to be in trouble.
What has the nature of Wagner or its successors' presence looked like in Africa since the death of Prigozhin? Colin, I'll stay with you because I know you've covered some of these cases quite closely.
So it's now known as Africa Corps. It's a lot more tightly hewn under the thumb of the Russian MOD, of the Kremlin, right? Once you had the march, the failed mutiny, whatever you want to call it, then it was time to kind of rein it in, right? It's still very necessary. It's still actually quite sought after in several African states, although it's got some other problems, particularly more recently. But again, it's got this calling card, it's got this brand, and they're willing to do the dirty work that some regimes find necessary and that others aren't willing to do. Sometimes it's just keeping the capital safe, right? And then having to go out into the hinterlands every now and again, and again, engage in counterinsurgency operations. But it's really just the human rights abuses. The things that Wagner does, or Africa Corps, whatever iteration you want to look at, those just aren't things that we're used to dealing with on a regular basis, right? So we kind of just step back and like, well, what's happening here? But I always think about what happens in 5 or 10 years once the resources are extracted, once they've worn out their welcome and they leave. We're leaving an inherently more unstable region. It's not just a failed state, it's a failed region. And who's going to clean up the mess? Inevitably, everyone's going to look to the United States. And by then we have half a dozen Al-Qaeda or ISIS-related affiliates that have dominated everywhere from coastal West Africa to the Lake Chad Basin. And then it's kind of like everyone looks at each other and shrugs.
Candace, what is it? How do you study the Wagner Group? Like how do you kind of look at where it's operating, what it's doing? It's just, I have always found it such a kind of difficult entity to kind of wrap my arms around.
Yeah, we've had many moments, I think you and I and others that sort of, try and follow the Wagner Group. And especially in the beginning, especially, if you think about like 2016, 17, when these stories started bubbling up, like in The Guardian and BBC, just these little tidbits. And it was like, who are these mysterious guys? Who's behind them? I found it extremely frustrating. So much so that I went and got training in open source investigation techniques with Bellingcat and a couple of other organizations to try and see if there's a way to through the fog. And so what that really consists of is really, I think, sort of like 2 or 3 pronged approach. Maybe 3 is probably about right. The first is just taking on board that if you pay attention to the headlines and the labels and the branding, you're going to miss the forest for the trees. Russia has, big structures for managing its military cooperation with other states like Syria or Mali or Central African Republic. Those are very public entities. They have real command structures and management systems and contracting processes. And I found that in the reporting, prior to my getting into it, a lot of people were just focused on these guys with masks and why don't they have insignia and what are they doing and the brutality. But if you pay attention to the system elements that support these types of actors, then you start to understand, oh, well, then there must be a command structure here. And it's most likely going to parallel some of the things that you saw, for instance, in Chechnya, right? Or, in other conflicts where Russia has been a big actor. And in fact, many of the guys who started the Wagner Group drew from that culture, right? From paratrooper culture. They literally basically grafted the command structure of a paratrooper airborne battalion onto what we now know today as the Wagner Group, and then just scaled it up into a brigade, basically. And you can only see that if you have a sense of the structure. So number one is paying attention to structure and system. And the second is using digital trails, to kind of follow the breadcrumbs and put together who relates to whom in terms of targeting entities. So looking at the shell companies, who owns them, the the planes that are flying, gear and guys into places like Central African Republic. Did a lot of cooperation with our colleague Jack Margolin on using open source investigative techniques to trace, for instance, the cargo planes that were delivering Panzer anti-aircraft batteries that were used in Libya to fight during the Tripoli offensive. Those are the techniques that you kind of need. And then I would say the third prong is you really, honestly, if you want to understand the scale of something like that, you need big data. And so for us, a lot of our work really centered on sucking up as much data as we could, whether it was social media data, large-scale corporate data. And we got very lucky. We had a partnership with C4ADS, and they very graciously provided us with access to about 130,000 leaked documents from Evropolis, which is a big company, one of the big companies that Prigozhin used to manage the Wagner enterprise. So all those things were really critical to kind of putting the puzzle pieces together.
I'm going to ask this question to both of you, but I'll start with you. What got you interested in the first place in the Wagner Group?
Oh boy. I guess I started being sort of obsessed with all things Russian from the time I was about 14. My mom is in the audience over here. She can tell you that story. And sort of like how I kind of came to end up speaking Russian and studying that in college. I spent time in St. Petersburg in 1995, 96, which was exactly the year when Yevgeny Prigozhin was opening his restaurant, the old Customs House. I had no idea that was really happening.
Did you eat there?
I did not eat there, but I am confident that I ate some of those hot dogs because they were sold at these kiosks. That was kind of like, that was their version of McDonald's at the time, right? It was like these kiosks that you would go to, and I was a student, and you kind of get wasted and have a party, drink vodka, and then afterwards you'd be like, I need sosiski, I need like a sausage, and so you go to. So I had this kind of I have lots of memories of St. Petersburg that just sort of I carried with me. I did a lot of reporting in the Caucasus, So I kept going back and forth, to what we call the Soyuz, the old Soviet Union, for many, many years, and including actually the edge of that, which is Afghanistan, which is kind of how we're connected to each other, and seeing how the Russian military operated and the imprint that they left in Afghanistan was extremely instructional for understanding how Wagner might partner with a foreign force, right? Because those same guys who were part of what was the beginning of Russia's Spetsnaz and sort of special forces were deploying in Afghanistan and doing all kinds of interesting, tricks that ultimately became very much part of the operational culture of what we know as the Wagner Group. So those things were actually really visible to me just from reading the stories and seeing the insignia and all the kind of vibing that they were doing. Was very obvious that there was more to the story. And I guess it was a mystery for me that I wanted to unravel.
Colin, what about you?
Reading some of Candace's work, actually, her early work on Wagner got me interested. I kind of look at violent non-state actors more broadly, so terrorists, insurgents, militias, and I thought, PMCs is something I haven't really investigated. This is just really not cool in that sense of cool to me because I'm a research nerd. Oh, here's this cool mercenary group that kills people with sledgehammers. And then I had, during my time at RAND, I had done a lot of work studying the wars in Chechnya for some work we had done for OSD on counterinsurgency, what worked, what didn't, different kind of lessons learned from those conflicts. And then, the interaction with ISIS. So at the time I was writing a book on the Islamic State called After the Caliphate. And so Wagner had locked horns with ISIS in Syria. And so started saying, who are these guys? What are they doing? And I've spent a lot of time actually thinking of the parallels between the Islamic State and Wagner, especially in terms of using extreme violence as a brand and a calling card, things that would make, 99% of people in the world look away. There's a certain attraction, by going beyond the pale that brings into the groups exactly the types of people they're looking for, right? And so that's why the Islamic State would publish beheading videos, the video of the Jordanian pilot being burned alive, all these things. You think, wow, they're really kind of culling out just the most sociopathic, fanatical people to join their group, who they then deploy in various ways. So that were kind of the origins of what got me, initially interested.
I never thought of that as like a calling card. Yeah. Well, with that, I want to open to questions from our audience. There is a mic, I believe it's still there, down at the front on the right. And I think we also have questions on Zoom. So maybe, Amanda, can we take one from Zoom while folks here get themselves down to the front?
Yeah. We have two from Zoom already. Someone is wondering if the Wagner Group had sleeper cells under Prigozhin.
Excellent question. And the answer is yes. And some of them are operating today in Europe. If you've been following some of these sabotage attacks that we've been seeing in Germany and the UK, in fact, I was just in London covering a trial involving charges against 8 men, all of them British citizens, who were charged variously with espionage and aiding and abetting and fomenting an arson attack on a warehouse that was owned by a Ukrainian couple that was supplying Starlink elements and components to the Ukrainian front. They were victimized and targeted. Their warehouse was burned down. There was a Russian dissident that was also targeted for assassination. They didn't get to him, but there was a sort of elaborate plan by these 8 young guys. Most of them were young. One was a 6-year-old kind of washout who was like the driver. But these guys had been enticed by a Wagner Group Telegram channel, Privyet bot, which is like hello bot, and sort of reached out to the ringleader, this guy Dylan Earl, who has since pleaded guilty. I can say that here in the United States. Apparently, I can't say that in the United Kingdom. I didn't know that. But in any case, the case is ongoing. It is one of several that I've been tracking that have a Wagner Group tie and involve, shady sabotage operations. And actually, a colleague of ours, who you know very well, Ben Dalton, who's been a really important partner in a lot of my research, he made a comment to me months ago. He was like, yeah, it's like reverse Gladio. And some of you might know, if you guys are history buffs in here, I suspect some are from, Spy Museum audience. Operation Gladio was a NATO operation to recruit among the mafia and criminal underground in Europe during the Cold War. And actually, they used former SS guys who kind of were interested in sort of remaining active to be kind of the chief curators of these saboteurs and underground networks. So it's a very similar concept that the Wagner Group now seems to be fomenting in the European theater.
I had no idea. That's fascinating.
What's happening?
Yeah. Well, I see we've got a whole queue of people here. Please, sir, and just if you could introduce yourself and just let our panelists know who your question is addressed to.
Pardon me. Thank you. My name is Peter Crispin. I actually work here at the Spy Museum. Great talk, first of all. My question is, it might be simplistic, but what is the current state of Wagner? I mean, you mentioned Africa Corps in Africa. The last I heard was that they were still, the Russian government had sort of co-opted it in Ukraine, and they were still getting people out of the prisons and sending them over there. But what is the current state, in June of 2025?
And can I also, this ties in very well with an online question, which is also, what is the current size? So state and size.
Size is difficult to say, I think, at this stage. Certainly, we've seen all kinds of different numbers. When Wagner went into the war in Ukraine in 2022, we counted about 13,000 plus. This was from leaked documents that were shared with us. I'm sure it was much larger than that. Those are just sort of the documents that we had. Ultimately, the evolution just before Prigozhin's death seemed to be around 25,000, certainly what he said. That seemed to fit with the number of battalions that were also deployed, which we were also able to reconstruct with data as well. In terms of its size today, I think Africa Corps actually has not hit its intended targets of 40,000, and nowhere near the 20,000 that was like the reset target. I would guess maybe 10, but I think that that's actually generous for Africa. And then in the field in Ukraine, I think those numbers now have dissipated, right? So it's the first volunteer corps. To answer your question, sort of like on what is the format of this organization now? So there are three branches. One is what we know as the Africa Corps or Expeditionary Corps, and that's the folks who are deployed to Africa. And then there's the first volunteer battalion, and then a third branch, which is kind of more affiliated with some Chechens, basically, which are scattered in Belarus, as far as we know. So they're kind of these three deployments, but I think numbers are difficult to come by nowadays.
Not only that, there's been some shifts. As you know, the Assad regime fell in December, and so the Russians are now prioritizing Libya more. And so that's something I'm tracking closely, is kind of movement of personnel, material, et cetera, to different theaters. And I think geopolitics is an important thing to keep track of, because as civil wars begin, as failed states kind of teeter into collapse, there's more opportunities for this group. I was kind of joking. Terrorism researchers have a bit of a morbid sense of humor if you ever spend any time with them. And so I was joking with a friend the other day. We were kind of watching what was happening in Iran and discussing whether the Russians were going to come to the Iranians' aid. And I said, well, maybe they're going to send Wagner in, kind of like, laughing emojis, knowing that wasn't a possibility. But, I think we haven't seen the end of Wagner in whatever form. And I think that's probably true of mercenary activity writ large. To me, that's a kind of, and I wrote an article in Defense One back in 2020, specifically looking at Libya, saying this could be in some ways the future of warfare. Drones, disinformation, and mercenaries. It's what my colleague Paul Kahn used to call wars of distance, or kind of war on the cheap, right? You're kind of doing this with minimal force. And any of these elements in and of themselves can be a force multiplier, but when used effectively, especially if you look at drones, although I'd look on the opposite side of where Wagner's fighting in Libya to what the Turks have done, supplying drones, they can really kind of tip the balance of power in some of these conflicts. So I think more countries are going to use them, frankly. And I think, this is probably the beginning of a trend toward more privatized form of warfare.
Please.
Hi, my name is Ginny Lash. I'm a college student right now. My question is for you, Colin. So you mentioned the need for the U.S. to kind of focus on like these quasi-proxy areas to really work on this power struggle that's going on right now. But these like groups, like the Wagner Group, tend to have fewer restrictions around them. Like the U.S. technically isn't allowed to support a coup regime, but the Wagner Group is able to. So I was wondering how you think the U.S. would be able to almost like best these groups in these
Sure.
regions.
It's a great question, and I'll give you an unsatisfactory answer. You're right. They get to color outside the lines, and we don't. They don't have to adhere to laws and policies and authorities, and we do. But I think a lot of what we do through the U.S. State Department, is almost a kind of preventive measure to having Wagner show up in your country, right? So when you think about aid to these countries, when you think of building partner capacity and security cooperation, those are the types of things, building rule of law, working through counter-corruption programs, doing a lot of work that USAID used to do. Taking that away opens up opportunities for groups like Wagner. So, being in the fight, being in places that might not seem geopolitically important right now, but that when you kind of look at, in the grand scheme of things, actually denying a toehold to our adversaries, right? Because if we say that we care about great power competition, we need to kind of put our money where our mouth is, and we need to put the resources to back it up. That prevents groups like that from having that chance in the first place.
I would just maybe add that one other consideration that you might think about is there's another sort of prong, which is just using the law. we talk about gray zone warfare, but what's gray? It's how you use law in favor of your advantage as a force, right? And that's essentially what the Wagner Group has done, is create a money laundering enterprise for the Russian government. Everything from taking diamonds, having them refined in UAE or in India, and then sort of using that cash to kind of feed the cycle of the war machine in Ukraine. Gold is another example. Building up the gold reserves is an alternative, right? Oil is another thing. But essentially, the way to think about the Wagner Group is this is a sanctions evasion, operation extraordinaire. It's a massive deception operation. It's designed to help primarily state enterprises that are allied with the Kremlin, and then also friends of Vladimir Putin. And so, while I am less optimistic than you are, perhaps, about the United States' ability and its credibility in the field of human rights and diplomacy in these types of regions, particularly in the Sahel, I am very optimistic that using the law to pursue accountability is a really good strategy. And it can be done in multiple ways using universal jurisdiction. And I've been covering some of those cases too in Finland and Poland and elsewhere. Seeing how the law actually can be applied either to a group that we see as an organized crime group, right? Sort of like any sort of normal cartel, or treating individuals who might be responsible for atrocities that we've seen online or elsewhere.
So we've only got a couple minutes left.
One last one from online. Are there any accounts of women in the Wagner Group?
Good question. I don't
Great
know.
question. 2 famous women, but they're accountants. They are literally the bag ladies who have been like holding the purse strings for a very long time. And you can look online if you want to check out uncoveringwagner.org. You can kind of see where they fit within the structure. We sort of map them in a network analysis of where they were. But they were really important, actually, accountants and administrators. But they were in no way fighting on the battlefield. So no Wagner ladies, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Just fighting in the Excel spreadsheets.
It's a missed opportunity on the merchandising, I think.
Indeed.
So with a few minutes left, I think I'll take the last two. Can we take the last 2 questions together?
Hi, my name is Jeremy Capsa. I'm a college student. It's actually my mom. So, if I'm not mistaken, Shoigu was dismissed, reassigned, and replaced with an economist. And, a lot of seems like the offensive success that Russia has in Ukraine is driven by these semi-autonomous units like Akhmat Special Forces. So I guess the question is, since Prigozhin, he died, that was unsuccessful, but since it seems like since his rebellion was more a revolt against the Ministry of Defense than a revolution, was it successful? What's the legacy of that in Russia, considering that he's kind of overthrown the Siloviki dominance over Ministry of Defense?
Great question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Santiago Villa. I also work here in the Spy Museum. My question was, Colin, you said that the U.S. was backing off from Africa, but one power that hasn't backed off from Africa is China. And China is arguably not very comfortable working in those gray war areas either. Do we know anything about what China's stance towards the Wagner Group is, and what conflicts might they have with such a large influence that the Wagner Group has in countries where they want to have business in?
However you want to do it.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the legacy, the post-Prigozhin legacy in the context of what happened with the Ministry of Defense. And this is actually covered in the epilogue, which I managed to just dash off like literally like moments before I was really like the hammer was coming down on me to turn in my manuscript. So there was a massive purge of the Ministry of Defense, the upper echelons. It didn't actually reach Shoigu until about a year after Prigozhin declared that he was going to march on Moscow. But there were about a dozen or so defense ministry generals, some of whom were very instrumental in, Prigozhin's rise, handed him contracts, probably received some kickbacks. So they were prosecuted variously for charges of corruption. Nothing to see here as far as Putin was concerned. So about a dozen or so individuals, and some of them were Wagner VIPs. We found actually a spreadsheet that had about 42 individuals. We couldn't see them all, but we could see quite a lot of them that were named as VIPs, which I guess gave them special status to like wear cool clothes on the battlefield. I'm not really sure what that was about. So a lot of those individuals seem to have been swept away. And to your point about Shoigu's replacement, Andrei Belousov, who's now the Minister of Defense, he actually was always involved in the shadows in the Wagner Group. Also on uncoveringwagner.org, you can check out the meetings that Prigozhin had with various individuals in the Kremlin. We did sort of a transect of that. And Belousov was one of the people who was featured along with several others who were very high up in the ministry. So I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same in some ways. I think what we can say is that Prigozhin won the argument when it came to innovation. And ultimately, the people who champion that kind of view of changing the way Russia approached warfare, I think won out in some ways. Although you couldn't really tell it from today's battlefield necessarily.
Yeah, so I'll speak to the China and Africa question. And one of my colleagues who's a China expert is here tonight, and we talk about this frequently and write about it. I often think of when major world events happen, what do the Chinese think? What are they're watching, and what are they learning from, X, Y, or Z? And I think, so a part of our book toward the conclusion deals with, what have other countries learned from the rise and fall of Wagner? Namely, what have other great powers like China learned? I think one is, if China gets into this business more earnestly, right, because China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has these projects that they need security for. We're seeing Chinese nationals be attacked, Chinese diplomats in parts of South Asia. As China becomes more of a rising and visible great power, there's a greater concern of kidnappings and attacks against its citizens. So at some point, I think it's going to need a more kind of robust and potentially present, force, whether that's a PMC or something else. The main takeaway is actually rather simple. Don't let, the person running your PMC become so autonomous that they're working at cross purposes to your objectives. You have these kind of perverse incentive structures, you have these parallel institutions, and that's not good for command and control. And so I think China looks at, in a very deliberate way, a lot of the mistakes that the Russians made, trying not to repeat them. And I think, I've also written before about Russia's latest foray into Ukraine and what that does for Russia over the long term. I've never been a big believer when we talk about great power competition. We say the US, Russia, and China. I think this is the beginning of their descent, and it's a two-country conversation between the US and China. The way that the Russians have fought in Ukraine poorly, it's not a good advertisement for your military, for training, for weapons. And I think, we're entering a phase where it really is going to be the United States and the Chinese. And so like every small incident throughout the globe is analyzed through that lens. And what do we learn? What do we take away from this? What are the lessons learned? Although I think our British friends have it better. They call it lessons observed. They argue that we don't actually learn our lessons, which is probably right. And that goes for any kind of minor skirmish or conflict. Even what have the last 12 days taught the Chinese? And I think there's a lot to take away. I'm still kind of like distilling and thinking through, how do they see this?
Well, please give it up for our fantastic guests today.
I want to thank Amy, just an amazing moderator, incredibly knowledgeable panel. Thanks.